One thing I always ask my Learning Hack guests is where they find their learning inspiration. The Learning Technologies Exhibition and Conference in London is a frequent answer. Celebrating its 25th year, it's been a key source of knowledge for me personally, bringing together the best in global learning. With some 10,000 attendees expected and more than 200 free floor seminars, it's a must-go-to show. Join us in London on April the 17th and 18th. Register now at learningtechnologies.co.uk. learningtechnologies.co.uk. Hold it right there. If you're not the sort of person who enjoys lively conversations about the history of learning theory, if names like Socrates, Hegel, Havelock leave you cold, then maybe this one isn't for you. But if you are that person, women and men, we give you Leonard Houx.
Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power.
Knowledge.
Education.
Sadly, this season of The Learning Hack is coming to an end. But the good news is, well, two bits of good news really. Firstly, we'll be back in September. And secondly, we're about to kick off a new season of our sister podcast, Great Minds on Learning. By way of a sort of handover, we invited along a friend of The Learning Hack, Leonard Houx, who we featured way back in 2020. Leonard told me that he's a fan of Great Minds on Learning and has some reflections about the series to share with us. But first of all, Kate Fitzgerald, head of FACT. Who is he?
Hack Facts.
Leonard Houx is an award-winning director of learning design, currently at the Cambridge Education Group and previously at Bayes Business School. Leonard studied at the University of Portland and at an Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York, as well as Columbia University and City University in London.
Leonard's response to what Donald Clark and I have been doing with Great Minds on Learning comes out of his own deep engagement with many of the thinkers and ideas we've covered over the 30 episodes so far. But he wanted to zero in on two areas in particular, the Greeks, who we covered in episode 12, and the German Idealists from episode 26. I make no apologies for going long and deep on this one. It might seem a bit academic to some, but I have to trust that other people will find the conversation as fascinating as I did myself. And I have to say that as a podcaster, it's just amazing to have listeners as engaged and as knowledgeable as Leonard, and the rest of you as well. Hi Leonard, it's great to have you on the podcast again. Welcome back.
Thanks.
It's almost 4 years since you were last on with us, talking about learning design theory and skateboarding. It was after that conversation, and partly because of that conversation, in fact, that I started up our sister podcast, Great Minds on Learning, with Donald Clark. Obviously, Donald has read absolutely everything about learning theory and was there with this whole horde of blog posts that we could use to get going on. But I think my conversation with you did start up an interest in where instructional design comes from and the theory and so on. So now we're on to our 6th season of GMOL, me and Donald, and I know you've been following the podcast during all that time, and we've discussed you doing a response to it. I know you've got a couple of things in particular you want to talk about today, the Greeks and the Germans, so that can form the spine of a structure here. It's a bit freewheeling apart from that. But before we get into that, can I first of all get your general views about the podcast series, Great Minds on Learning? And, you don't have to blow smoke. So in the vein perhaps of insights and oversights, what's it been getting right? What's it kind of missing out on maybe?
So I guess first let me say about the phrase insights and oversights, which I think I mentioned to you. It's a phrase that I really love. It's from a book, actually, from an American philosopher named Charles Hartshorne. And he wrote this book called Insights and Oversights of Great Thinkers. And it took me probably about 20 years from hearing about the book to actually reading it. But but I just love this title because I mean, it held so much promise that, and it's like so delightfully pretentious. Like this guy is basically going to look at the history of philosophy and straighten everybody out, and it kind of, I don't want to, I'm not trying to play on like trying to use like whatever, I don't know, too overly youthful analogies, but it does sort of remind me of, my son has been getting into listening to 50 Cent, and he asked me the other day, like, oh, what's your favorite 50 Cent song? And I lived in New York when 50 Cent came out, and he had this song called How I Rob. And the whole song was just basically about how he went through a catalog of everyone in the rap and R&B industry and described how he was going to rob them. And he just basically started off his career, pissing off everybody. And in a way, it's almost like Charles Hartshorne is kind of, like I kind of imagined his book was like that. And then I read it, and it was the most tiresome. It was such a disappointment. It was so tedious. And it was, I guess, in a way, like what you might think it was like, where, he's going, well, Spinoza was good here because he agrees with me, but here he doesn't agree with me, and that's not so good. And there was like no real kind of critique. It was pretty dull. And I spent, I spent like my holiday with friends in Provence, by the swimming pool, reading this terrible book. Anyway, so that's Insights and Oversights. The other kind of idea I had about like a name for the podcast was more of a comment than a question, because that's also kind of how I feel about talking about, Donald Clark's virtuoso performance of, the history of thought related to education, is that I'm this kind of belligerent mansplainer, who's kind of arrogantly, coming in, but which is only just to say, who am I to comment, on, this really incredible series that you and Donald have done. Now, what do I think about it? I think it's been amazing. I think that it's, to my mind, it's like so much what the world of learning and L&D and really ed tech, all of it, sorely lacks. It's what we need so much, and we're constantly in this cycle of this kind of horrible, vicious cycle of announcing a new revolution, a new idea, when we're like the most people in education generally the most likely to claim to be introducing a new idea, and the least likely to know whether it's actually a new idea or not. And so, taking this step backwards and kind of looking at a big view of the landscape is so salutary. And when I say that too, I should say I am not just talking about the world of podcasts or blogs or conferences, but the educational research. It's really surprisingly often that you read in the educational research, you see this profound lack of like a strong background or good, literature reviews. So the second reason I should say that I love it is because it is so contrary, and it's not like the kind of, not talking about, people who like to argue or stage controversies, because I think there's a lot of that in the learning world where it happens on a kind of shallow level, but where, you see the room, you read the room and the mood, and then you just do something completely different. And, I feel like this is your punk moment, John, that you're like,
well, I've already had one of those.
Yeah, you've kind of seen
another
one.
one.
You already had one, I guess. Yeah, this is your punk renaissance, but and I guess the last thing is just that I do love theory, and so getting to hear Donald so fluently talk through all these topics is a great pleasure.
So that's great to hear. Glowing with pride, slightly teary-eyed. So before we kind of, get to be wallowing in sentimentality about how wonderful we all are, perhaps we should dive in. So you wanted, first of all, to talk about the Greeks. Let's start at the very beginning. Very good place to start. Of course, they weren't the beginning because they were the pre-Socratics. But so Donald and I did an episode about Greeks in season 2, which at the time was the furthest back that we had gone. I have to say, in the upcoming season, we're going back further than that to the birth of writing. And you told me you have things you'd like to raise on that topic. So this is interesting to me because we're formulating the next season. We're going to go back to the birth of writing. And you wanted to talk about Homer as the original curriculum and I really don't know how to pronounce this, Chiron as the original teacher.
Yeah.
Chiron,
and
yeah.
so
yeah, and
yeah.
Chiron's a centaur, which is a first on the podcast to have a half human, half beast mythical creature rather than some kind of crusty old German. Although we've got plenty of those. And then the sophists, Socrates, Plato, and Havelock's thesis about Socrates and slavery in the Greek Empire. I mean, there's a lot to cover there. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of that, but would you like to kind of kick off? Maybe with Homer.
So maybe run kind of scattershot here, but so you and Donald talked about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and so forth. And I think what might be helpful is to maybe set the stage a bit for how radical the change that that was happening in Greece really was. That Plato and Socrates were really at the forefront of, or the kind of doing it maybe the most. And so, before basically the advent of the kind of the proper Greek alphabet and literacy in Greece, the ancient Greek curriculum, I think, first of all, was entirely an elite phenomenon. It was, it was for, the aristocracy, and it was comprised of sport, poetry, and art. So typically, a school would have sport in the morning, and then poetry, and then poetry was musical. So it had a kind of harp or musical accompaniment that would accompany the poetry. So it was more like singing, and then sometimes there would be art, sometimes not. And the poetry, this is the important bit, the poetry was largely Homer, and basically the learning of the poetry was just a process of just memorizing it. And poetry was really like the kind of the information system of the time. They didn't, not having books, rhyming verse was the way that information was stored. And so poetry was kind of, a lot was put on poetry. There was a lot that they tried to do with poetry. So poetry told histories, so much of, through there were sagas. Some Greek scholars think that some of the ancient myths were actually ways of telling history. They were kind of historical allegories. There were catalogs within the poetry. So, when you read the Iliad, there is like a catalog of types of sailing ships that are listed. But
that's an extremely boring chapter of the Iliad, it has to be said.
Yeah,
the list of ships,
maybe hard to memorize, but most importantly, it was how they taught virtue or arete. And the 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 young student was meant to identify. They learned virtue through identifying or not identifying with the heroes of these stories, with Achilles' bravery or Odysseus's cleverness, and so that's just almost like what it meant to be clever. So I have a quote from and this is a reflection. This is the point, is that it was a reflection of an oral culture. So Neil Postman, talking about the biblical, ancient Near East culture, he has this quote about Solomon where he says, the wise Solomon, we are told in First Kings, knew 3,000 proverbs. And, he says, in a print culture, people with such a talent are thought to be quaint at best, more likely pompous bores. But in an oral culture, a high value is always placed on the power to memorize. For where there are no written words, the human mind must function as a mobile library. And so memorization and then identification. And there's more to say about identification, but maybe for a moment, I'll jump to Chiron, the original hero teacher. So Chiron was in the Iliad, he was a mentor teacher to Achilles, and he was a centaur, and the Achilles' parents gave Achilles, he was raised by Chiron. I think the word they use is reared by Chiron, and taught martial skills. He was taught fighting with weapons and hunting and archery. He was taught music, as was part of this Homeric curriculum. It says he was taught some medicine, and he was also a sort of a father figure. So they say that I think he reared him with love, and so to me this is just amazing. You can see this in there's some ancient Greek pots where you can see Achilles' mother handing Achilles to Chiron, the centaur, and he's a kind of an aged centaur. And I mean, in a way, I think initially, I was saying this to my wife, did you know that, Achilles is meant to have been taught by a centaur? And she's like, well, she didn't seem that blown away. I was like, she was like, well, yeah, I mean, it's like you want to, it's like an image of kind of the ultimate, kind of teacher. He's like, and so even in some versions, Chiron is omniscient, he's sort of everything. And we see this kind of, I don't know, this kind of archetype handed down, I think of Yoda, or Morpheus in the Matrix, or Professor Dumbledore, this person who's otherworldly in their great knowledge. Anyway, so that was Chiron, but back to the Homeric curriculum and what this break was. And Havelock, who's a classicist, has this kind of thesis about what was going on, and that part of what was the change that happened involved a kind of epistemological break, where it's, as he puts, there was for the first time, a separation of the knower and of the known. And I think this has a huge amount of import and should be very thought-provoking for people who work in education, particularly in online education. So Havelock will say, the Iliad and Odyssey were, they worked on a system of memory. This was the culture's information system, and that because everything was in this kind of system of identifications, what and what was lacking, what you don't see when you read the Iliad, is a sense of self. There wasn't a language of self. So Achilles is full of personality and of vigor and decision making, but he isn't like a person who kind of sees himself as a self, has like where his there's an ego, there's an I that's like the seat of decision making. So what Plato was doing, and this is part of why, as you guys talked about, why Plato really had a problem with poetry, is that there needed to be this kind of a break where he was introducing, in a sense, two things in this separation of knower and known. The first was this concept of a psyche. And the word psyche already existed, but its meaning changed, and to kind of go from being like just a kind of a ghost or wraith, ghostly life force, to being a ghost that thinks. And I'm sure that Donald would say that, point out that this is the beginning, perhaps, of a kind of Cartesian dualism and this kind of really unnecessary concept of, as Gilbert Ryle said, the ghost in the machine.
Yeah.
But I think there's something more fundamental going on, where it's really trying to, on a more basic level, establish a sense of self, of the individual. And so that's the one thing. And then on the other hand, there's an idea of knowledge as independent from individual people. And you see this, I suppose, especially in Socrates, where by his method of questioning and his kind of tropes of humility, of not knowing anything, he's trying to say that knowledge doesn't belong to anyone, truth doesn't belong to anyone. I mean, this is going into the biblical world, but King Solomon had memorized all these words, and he was rich, and he had so many wives, but and so he was considered the wisest man in the world at that point, from their perspective. But from Socrates' perspective, truth is just truth. It doesn't matter who you are, when you're saying something true. Either it's true or it's not. And as we kind of, in the online learning world, work in a space where sometimes that connection between the persona who's offering the truth, or the learning, and the information, sometimes they can get sort of decoupled or merged and put together in different ways because of how we manage the process. It's a really to my mind, a really important idea.
And what we're talking about here is the separation of content from the human contact, the relationship between a teacher and a pupil, and the relationship between that pupil and content, which is encoded knowledge. And is what you're saying here, to play that back, that where we get this kind of handover from an oral culture, where knowledge is contained within the kind of rhythms of poetry, and the person who is transmitting the poetry and keeping it going as part of an oral tradition. And then we get to the kind of Athenian moment where writing has come in, and the knowledge can be encoded within style and eventually books and so on, and that separation happens there. It might be worth talking just a little bit about about Homer and the question of Homer's authorship, because a lot of people won't necessarily know this, that Homer for years was personified as a person, the blind poet, and so on. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, this character Milman Parry, who I'm very interested in, who a scholar who decided that Homer wasn't necessarily a person, but kind of stood at the end of a long tradition of oral transmission. And you had these characters who were called rhapsodes, who would go around all over ancient Greece in the kind of pre-writing period, and they would know all these poems that had been kind of orally transmitted. And he found that there was a kind of survival of this type of oral culture in Yugoslavia, and traveled to Yugoslavia and went to remote inns and met the rhapsodes who would read, sing their kind of tales, which were kind of history and folk memory and legend and myth all rolled into one. They weren't actually the Odyssey and the Iliad, but they were very similar. And Milman Parry looked into the way that the tricks of memory that were used within the poetry and found these in Homer as well, these kind of epithetical phrases like the rosy-fingered dawn, the wise Athena, the brave. There's an incredible, nowadays we read translations of Homer, it reads like a prose narrative, but the original was poetry, and it's incredibly repetitious. And this was an aid to memory for the rhapsodes, that they would have these little kind of epithetical units that they would string together, and that would help them to kind of memorize, and they'd have the musical rhythm, and they'd sing it as much as tell it in accompaniment to a lyre. And we have some kind of recordings of Serbo-Croat rhapsodes doing this stuff, and it is quite an extraordinary thing to listen to, because it's not music, it's not something you'd have on Spotify. And it's not poetry, it is something else. And that sort of thing is where Homer originates and comes from. And the moment of Athenian philosophy is kind of in the handover from that culture to a new culture, which is one where content exists sort of divorced from a transmitter, from a singer of tales. Is that useful?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's what, I mean, Havelock is very much building from Parry's work, and so absolutely. And you see this in there were phrases that were formulas, and there were also kind of types of stories that were formulas that then would get reconfigured. So if you needed to tell another story, you could kind of take this previous story and mix different bits around. It also touches on something that I was maybe going to get to later, which was that kind of remixing some of these stories, especially myths, was a general Greek teaching tool. So many of the Greek philosophers and scientists of the time took the format of myth as a way to communicate some of their big ideas. And so Protagoras, when he wanted to talk about the nature of man and how they use tools, he took the myth of Prometheus and added his own bits. And so there was a kind of a process of censoring and reconfiguring different bits, which in a way kind of shows, maybe as a corrective to maybe a caricature of Havelock's portrait of the oral culture. There was always a kind of a dynamism there as well, where people were taking these parts and changing them. Just to kind of maybe last point about Havelock is that part of what's exciting, I think, about Havelock, or why I was so kind of thrilled when I read it, is that this is not, your standard like ideas shaping education, but it's actually education shaping ideas. The kind of the new educational opportunities allowed for these ideas to make sense. So maybe also before I jump to slavery, um, as you do, another idea that was, since I think you were talking about it, John, about the presence of the teacher, something that runs throughout Greek education, from kind of early discussions of it to the sophists and on, was this idea of association, or what they called synesthesia. And it's just this idea that learning happens through being around the right people. And this is even at the basis of Socrates' trial. If you read the trial of Socrates, it hinges on this idea of association, because they say that Socrates is a horrible person to be associated with. And in a way, I think there's part of what, in Havelock's thesis, there's something that Plato is challenging there about association, but on a kind of that surface level, it's actually not questioned. So Socrates actually talks about the importance of association, and that's why, for example, he doesn't charge fees, because he can have true association with the people he talks to. He can have true synesthesia when there's no, the barriers of fees is removed. So just a quick kind of thing about slavery. You mentioned slavery in the podcast, but I think that there's a few things maybe worth saying about slavery and its relation to education. So first, with Plato, it's worth saying that Plato never addressed education. He talked about education a lot, but never as an end in itself. It was always an extension of his politics. And so the education was part of how you answered the question of how you made the ideal city-state.
Yeah.
And his politics, as we know, was one that completely accepted slavery and inequality as kind of hardwired into his ideal. Another two more points to make. The second is that, as Alfred North Whitehead observed this really beautifully in a book called Adventures of Ideas, that you see in ancient Greece these two parts that are kind of seem to be in conflict, although no one seems to realize it, which is this idea of the psyche, of the self, and which then kind of becomes a Christian idea of the soul, and slavery, and which, I mean, to Whitehead's mind, there's this kind of inherent dignity. There's inherent kind of an inherent, we have because someone has a soul, we have a moral responsibility to this person. This person has an inherent dignity. But it's not till the 1700s where an anti-slavery movement even starts emerging, in England, and there's people that are saying, hey, this is maybe this isn't great. The other thing to say, I think maybe the most important point for our purposes, is that partly as a result of this culture that was really built on slavery, is that we, bracketing the kind of the difficulties of trying to assign, I'm not trying to assign causality, but we inherit a culture that looks down in many ways on work. And, so, they didn't respect these slaves. And as a result, we have these kind of knock-on effects, like that maybe in a way, this is part of the reason why Plato looked down on empirical approaches. To him, actually looking at the stars in order to do astronomy, that was kind of cheap. The real people do it in their heads. Or, you think of like the Pythagoreans, they, like one of their many weird rules was that if they dropped something, they wouldn't pick it up,
They had a lot of
I
weird
think,
rules, didn't they? Not putting your sock
yeah,
on. You had to put
but
the left sock on before the right sock, or the left shoe on before the right shoe, or whatever.
yeah. And the Pythagoreans were very much of this um, kind of Platonic mentality too, of not, of starting with in the mind and not the physical world. And we have this now, where we still struggle to see often the connection between the world of our hands and of work and learning. I used to do a reading group. I've done many reading groups, but I used to do a reading group with some friends, mostly in universities in London, and we had one that was organized by Toby.
Toby from Filtered.
Yeah, Toby from Filtered, who I think is
Toby Harris. Yeah.
Yeah, Toby Harris.
Friend of the podcast.
Yeah, top chap, Toby.
Yeah.
He co-organized a reading group session where it was a great kind of L&D meets higher ed moment. And it was about the world of work and learning. And he had this piece of research, really fascinating piece of research from the 70s by this guy named Ellen Tuff called Why People Learn. And it was looking at, it just was a very simple piece of research where they interviewed adults about how they learn and what they do. And what they found was that most adults would say, when asked about like, what time do you dedicate to learning? They'd say, oh, hardly any, I'm just, my life has moved on since then. And then they'd say, well, what do you do? And then they'll say, well, I go to, like, on Sunday mornings, I go to my Pilates class, and then I'm doing a gardening workshop later. And, and there would be like, actually, and then they'd say, oh, and then I'm reading, and then I spent the evening reading a book or something. But because it's not formalized, because it's not in a classroom, they don't see those things as learning.
Yeah.
And it's the same, with, being in the workplace, trying new things in the workplace. We don't always make the connection. I think this is probably more just a human condition thing. Maybe, I don't know if we can blame it on Plato, but it's something we deal with. And then the other thing is, for those of us working in universities, it would feel as if we're inheriting Plato's culture, where we often have to work with people where working with the tools, working with technology is seen as a lower status activity. And it's a bit like, I don't know, how women in the 50s and 60s, in order to progress in their careers, used to have to say that they didn't know how to type. There's like, I think academics feel like if they admit that they know actually, how to build things in the LMS or VLE, then it could be damaging for their career.
The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. So you talked about the separation of the knower from the known. And this is something that happened, what was it, with the beginning of writing, or is it something that comes in with Socrates, Plato? Firstly, if you answer that, and then what are the implications for education beyond it?
So I think it's happening with a certain language that is mostly being introduced through Socrates and Plato. Some could argue that it could be seen in earlier Greek writers like Democritus, but there's a language of the self, and then there's a certain kind of philosophical language where they talk about the thing in itself, where they're trying to kind of, there's a sort of discourse that you see, especially with Socrates, where he's trying to say, like, what is the thing itself, or, what is justice itself, not just, and try to separate things out from their exemplars. Why is all this important? Why is this sort of separation of the knower from the known important, and why is Havelock important? I think that there's a few kind of amazing things, like really incredible things that are all going on at the same time. And I'll try to do justice to it. I think first, what Havelock is trying to explain is that what Plato was doing, and what really the sophist, the kind of the early Greek philosophical movement and the sophists were a part of, was a huge technological transformation in that society, one of the most profound to ever happen, where it was transitioning from an oral culture to a written culture. Mm-hmm. And to understand that transition, and to understand the Homeric culture, to understand the culture, before that time, it's really necessary to understand the constraints that are imposed by not having physical recording materials, and the techniques that were used, the way they used music, the way they used this sort of trance-like state to identify with the verse that was being used, is all is an information system. It's all for the memory storage. And when the Greek alphabet was created and it was being stored on paper, there was all of a sudden space for people to communicate and store information in other ways. And there was a kind of a literal space that was created by having information that was outside of you. And I don't like the kind of the typical thing, I think, especially in the UK for some reason, maybe because Raymond Williams, who he wrote this critique of Marshall McLuhan, was British. It had more impact here, but first thing that often people say is this is technological determinism, and I think that even Raymond Williams himself, I think, was a bit more nuanced than that, but it becomes a kind of a way that people shut down these conversations, much to their own detriment, because like, it's to my mind, like, you can't understand really what was going on without this context. And was it necessary? Did it have to happen? No, but to my mind, it's incredibly clear that this new way of talking about knowledge and truth and information and learning had greater resonance because of the material supports, because of the material conditions, because the technologies that were available, and that in an oral culture, yes, like, all this stuff could have been said too, but would it have made the same amount of sense? No. And actually, this has been seen actually as in anthropologists that have investigated oral cultures. So that's kind of the main kind of headline. I think that the other thing to kind of emphasize is that even though what Plato's, especially in the Republic, his sort of overarching vision is political. He's in the Republic, he's trying to describe it's a vision for the ideal city-state, and education is never talked about like as a means in itself. Education was really huge to this whole conversation, and it was ultimately why Socrates was killed, was over educational grounds, for corrupting the youth. It's what Aristophanes was really targeting Socrates for, and through Socrates, the rest of the sophist philosopher educators, was the way that they educated. And part of what they did that was so controversial is that they opened up education. They opened up education beyond the aristocracy, and people like Aristophanes was a conservative. Aristophanes was a traditionalist, and people like him and Pindar would argue that it's only ever appropriate to teach arete, or to teach justice, to the aristocracy. This is, you can't make, to them, the process of education was the process of itself of making someone noble. And so, bringing out, in a sense, what was already there. Whereas Socrates is presenting a very radical solution by saying not only that can anyone learn anything, but that, and this is where it's really extreme, is he said, like, I don't even teach anyone anything. He says that, I don't teach. And no one can teach anyone anything. That's what really, like, if you read the Republic of Plato, like what Socrates says in it, like what he summarizes the message of the allegory of the cave as being, when he sums it up, it's not about the troubles of the enlightened. It's about the process of education. That's what he says. He summarized the main point as being, is that some people think that education is a process whereby a teacher gives information or gives truth, I forget where they use, to another person, when really education is the process of directing someone's body at the light.
Okay.
And so it's a very radical vision of, like, the possibility that anyone can learn. And just as this idea of the soul, it has the seeds of, like, a radical idea of equality between human beings. This idea of learning, whatever the kind of questions you might have. I mean, I don't believe in the doctrine of recollection and the eternity of the soul, which is what it's based on. But what it's achieving, I 100% believe in and am inspired by, which is that anybody can learn anything. And ultimately, anyone could get in a position where they can teach anything.
Yeah, so it's a drawing out. Could I just to kind of establish one thing about the death of Socrates? What was his crime? Because his crime was corrupting the youth. I think we kind of get confused about this, because Socrates liked to hang around with young boys, and we have an imperfect, I think, understanding of the Greek idea of sex. It's very different, and of homosexuality and so on. When they said that he was corrupting the youth, they just mean he was a dirty old man who liked young boys, or is it more to do with something social and political about his ideas of what education meant? Was it because
absolutely.
a disruptive force in his hands? Is that it?
Yeah, so it's tied to there was the accusation of impiety, so that he was questioning the civic religion, which is why, for example, people say that Plato is very careful to involve civic religion in his academy, because he didn't want to suffer the
same way as Socrates.
And this is also something that Aristophanes picks up on, is Socrates' atheism, his critique of the gods, and that's what even The Clouds is about. Like, why they call the play The Clouds is because he says, like, look, the lightning doesn't strike down when people tell lies. Lightning just comes from clouds when they're storming. And then, there's also people who would argue that this was also to do with some bigger, broader political changes. But what Havelock would say is that his real crime, or the real way that he corrupted the youth, is that he questioned the poets. And in so doing, he broke the spell. He broke the spell because, when they were saying, these beautiful words, he ruined it by saying, okay, this bit where you say just, or this bit where you say, good, what do you mean by that? And it broke the spell, the kind of enchantment that this created was broken by his asking these questions.
And that spell being an integral part of oral transmission.
Yes.
Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
absolutely. Yeah.
So the
and
kind
that
of
enchantment,
Homeric,
that sense of enchantment was one of the, in a sense, the old technology. That was part of the old technology that held the whole thing together.
yeah. So it's as if
There's actually a funny example of this, where it's funny to think it's almost 20 years old now. I remember my brother telling me about it, where it took the lyrics from Notorious B.I.G.'s One More Chance, and it had the literal translation of what he is saying. And it just ruins it. It just completely ruins the song. In a funny way, that's what Homer was, or excuse me, what Socrates was doing to Homer and others.
Okay, so it's as if in the middle of a Doors concert, the philosopher had jumped onto the stage, taken the microphone away from Jim Morrison and said, "What exactly do you mean by the end? Is this
exactly.
So started getting all kind of intellectual and left brain in the middle of this kind of hieratic, incantatory, sort of mystical communal experience. Am I explaining that at all?
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
we'd have to recreate the scene or something. Yeah, but then,
and younger people
really
might not know who the Doors are. So
he was a big, in a way, it's like, he was the big party pooper, who just like ruined the fun almost. But
interesting.
That I think it was amazing, because it shows, I guess on one hand, this sort of possibility for any of us, to change and to learn and to become better people. And then I think it also it really illustrates how actually like technology and I guess cultural processes can interact in a way that creates like profound change. And so some of those ideas, they set the seed for like great equality, but they also were ideas that made these big changes that were already happening make sense.
In season 5, we covered the German Idealists, Kant, Herbart, Hegel, Humboldt. Now you've got things to say on the subject, Humboldt, and whether and how he had an influence. You want to talk about Lernfreiheit, which is learning freedom, Lehrung und Forschung, teaching and research, Bildung, culture, and then Dilthey, that's a name, not a concept, and the humanities. And there's a long German word there, which I will mispronounce now. It sounds like one of those German words for a particular railway ticket that is longer than the name of a village in Wales. Geisteswissenschaften, and Hegel and recognition. Again, a lot. If you've survived the first half about the Greeks, buckle in. There's a lot here. I don't know if we can fit it all in, but let's dive in and see how we get on. Give us your hot take on Humboldt.
Well, maybe move a bit faster. So I guess the first thing to say about Humboldt is that Humboldt is a very, very paradoxical figure. His place in history is very paradoxical. In many ways now, Alexander von Humboldt is is a very obscure figure. Not many people know about him, but in the 19th century, he was one of the most famous people in the world. He was huge. He I don't think Donald mentioned this, that there's over 300 things named after him, animals, phenomena, places. They were going to name the state of Nevada Humboldt at one point.
Wow.
They do have in California Humboldt County, which I think is like the weed capital of America, but don't think Humboldt's got anything to do with that. But he spent, I guess that's the first paradox. The second paradox is he spent a huge amount of time as a government and university administrator, but much of his work and writing is profoundly anti-bureaucratic, and his idea of the university is as a kind of antidote to this kind of looming bureaucracy and this increasing kind of movement towards turning people into machines. And I think the third paradox is that he is, in our own time, among people like us, really famous for one thing, that he is associated, really identified with the birth of the modern research university, particularly the kind of the German style research university. But maybe that's not correct, because that is the kind of our idea of
to recapitulate a point that came up in the Great Minds on Learning episode. We're blaming him for, or attributing to him, the fact that we have universities that combine teaching with research.
Yes,
and that sort of be going back to Humboldt. Yeah,
but then the kind of the strange paradox, final paradox, is that in Germany itself, at least on the level of discourse, his influence is hard to find. So there's a book, actually have it right here. It's by this guy, Johann Röstling, Humboldt and the modern German university, where, he goes through rector speeches, through, policy documents, at least in the 20th century, and Humboldt's nowhere to be found. And so, what does that mean? I don't know. I'm not totally sure. Was it that, I think, when we think about what happened in Prussia and other German states at the time, this birth of a modern research university, maybe we have to look beyond Humboldt to some extent, and look at the role of things like the government funding and how this was really a state project. I think that you have to look to maybe other people, other voices at the time as well. And I think that maybe the other thing, like kind of my final thought about Humboldt, is that we have to maybe we can think of Humboldt as not just this kind of event in the past, but as a dialogue partner for the future. There's so many things that when you hear Humboldt's ideas and you read him, that speak completely to our experience now. The importance of freedom, was a big thing for him, or Lernfreiheit. So he was a great promoter of choice for students, and so students at that time weren't in a kind of a set. University students didn't have a set curriculum; they could take whatever they wanted, and I think there's obviously costs that come with that too. But this idea of giving students ownership of their own learning, I think is so critical,
and the ability
overall,
to follow their own interest rather than
absolutely, and to kind of build something based on the questions that they're asking. and then also, this idea of, I mean, because the whole thing, like, for Plato, like education came out of his politics, and I think for Humboldt, education came out of a certain idea of a person and of his anthropology, as it were, and what makes a fulfilled person. And he talked about self-activity, self-actus, and it's the same with the word building. Like building is in German it's like a reflexive verb, so you're sich building, or you're educating yourself.
Okay.
Or I think that's how it typically works. I'm not expert, but it's this idea of self-activity and being well-rounded, having a kind of a broader kind of development where you're interested in in art and culture. And so anyway, that's Humboldt. Do we have time to talk quickly about Dilthey and recognition?
Dilthey, that's how you pronounce it. Yeah, just quickly, my Humboldt story. When I was recently at the Online Educa Berlin conference in Berlin, where I met you last in the flesh.
Yeah.
I was walking down the street towards the place, and I came upon this statue. It was a statue of Humboldt. I thought, great, I can take a photograph of this and do a whole LinkedIn post about, here we are, we covered him in Great Minds on Learning, and now here I am at the Learning Conference, how it all ties in. Unfortunately, when I looked a bit more closely at the photograph, I realized it was his brother.
Yeah, oh, cool.
Who's the naturalist.
Yeah,
because it's very close to the zoological gardens.
Yeah, because apparently, the University of Humboldt is named after both of them.
Oh, I didn't know that. No.
Yeah, it's the Alexander and his brother.
Yeah. Okay, so Dilthey, I'm reading.
Dilthey. I guess the one thing I just wanted to say about Dilthey that interests me, and in a way, this is kind of how our picture of the modern research university might need a kind of broader portrait, is that he writes about the Geisteswissenschaften, and which is like translates to the humanities, or that's the word that they use for the humanities, and its difference from the sciences, and the way that he characterizes it. He was also a German romanticist as well, and is that the purpose of the humanities is Verstand, or the understanding of great minds, of Geists, great Geists. And I think what's maybe worth emphasizing here is that there was a kind of a special moment in the history of interpretation that was happening at that time in Romantic hermeneutics, where what understanding meant was almost like a kind of getting into somebody else's head, is like feeling and experiencing and thinking the way that person did. And hermeneuts, or historians of interpretation would emphasize that this was a unique moment, so before that, interpreting a text was about the text, and then after that, interpreting a text was about the text. But in this kind of one moment, it was like very, very author-centered. And I guess I always think, and this was my whole thought about Dilthey, is that maybe this is the linchpin, the implicit linchpin of Forschung und Lehrung, that like the way that, because we know that people have done lots of meta-analyses and meta-analyses of the relationship between teaching and research, and the effect is zero, right? Like it's not a positive effect, it's not a negative effect, it's just no effect. Research does not make people better teachers. It doesn't make them worse, but it doesn't make them better. And so, in terms of opportunity cost, it's not a good look. But what maybe is really sort of underneath it, I think what's maybe truly underneath it for all of us is this kind of almost idea of connecting with great minds, and of connecting. And this is why even like the lecture at the time, the lecture was proof of genius, it was why people went to see Hegel, give a lecture. It was because Hegel was a genius and you wanted to witness it. And so anyway, that's my whole kind of whatever, little random thought about Dilthey.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? We have this concept of kind of sitting at the feet, so to speak, is that actually to be in the presence. And I have a friend who studied psychology at university, and she met Anna Freud, and it was a story she told for the rest of her life, that she had kind of had that physical contact with the Freud family.
Absolutely, and I think that's maybe part of, you were talking about cultishness and education, and I think this is maybe part of it, and it's why people want to touch the hem of Jesus's garment, as it were, and have those moments, and I mean, I think of like I had a moment where when I lived in New York, I was really good friends with this retired philosophy professor from MIT named John McNeese, and John McNeese was a very good friend of what's his name, who did the Thin Red Line, Days of Heaven.
Yes, not Malick.
Yeah, Malick, Terrence Malick.
Yeah.
Terrence Malick is also from a philosophy background, for what it's worth, probably one of the many reasons why he's such an excellent director. And anyway, in kind of my weird New York life, we all went out to the movies. He and my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and Terrence Malick and John McNeese and I, and then afterwards we chatted. And but like, I guess my point is that and I made my brother really jealous, who's a big movie fan, but like, what's brilliant about John McNeese is experienced in watching, Days of Heaven. That's where his genius sits. If you just go and see a movie and like, I mean, we had a fascinating discussion afterwards, but that's not how genius is really touched. Anyway,
it's an interesting thing though, because isn't there a difference between, okay, there's a great artist who you admire, and they say you should never meet your heroes, and then you meet that person, you love their records or their books, whatever, and you have a conversation with them, and it's banal, and you think, well, how could this person have created this amazing thing? This is just an ordinary
in a
man
way,
or an
actually,
ordinary woman.
this is really
that
beautiful.
Is that the same as a relationship with a great teacher? When you meet that person and they don't have anything to say to you, you'd expect that the teacher actually had a bit more to convey, because the artistic process of creation is they make stuff. What a great teacher does, it might be they write great books, but aren't they supposed to be passing stuff on in person as well? Is there a difference?
This is really beautiful, John, because this brings us back to Plato and Plato's Symposium. And there's a moment, where, in the Symposium, it's meant to be this kind of feast, and they've invited all the, the great and good, famous philosophers of the time and playwrights to talk about love. And people give these different speeches. There's some speeches that are meant to be kind of taking the piss, like, out of other people, and it's got all kinds of moments in it. It's an amazing piece of literature that everybody should read. But there's this one moment that's like the most brilliant moment in the whole thing, and it's where Alcibiades, who's a young actor, appears, and he's young and he's beautiful, but he's not like meant to be the cleverest chap. And he says, he tells this story of trying to sleep with Socrates, like trying to get Socrates to sleep with him. And he says that Socrates is like a statue with a gem inside, which was a thing apparently in ancient Greece, you'd have these, I forget the Greek term for it, but it's like, and it's, it's like there's this idea that, you're seeing the surface, but there's something there. There's this special kernel, or Slavoj Žižek would talk about, the Kinder egg or something, like there's the surprise, there's the surprise in the Kinder egg somehow there, even though you can't see it. And yeah, I mean, it's a big part of the education experience is,
So
that
what's
we look
what's
to
his
these
point
people.
about Alcibiades? What is his point about
Uh,
Socrates from that metaphor?
It,
Let's make it really
I
obvious.
think it's about I think it's about he's trying to explain why this beautiful man was attracted to this ugly man, and in a way, maybe the 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 impossibility, to put it in a kind of French philosophy sounding way, there's a kind of this impossibility of the situation, that he's trying to get something that in a way maybe he can never get.
So you never quite get the inside of the Kinder egg, the little plastic thing that you can assemble as an ambulance or whatever.
Yeah, but then, no one ever gives up in
Yeah,
life,
yeah.
trying to do this. The last thing is about recognition. So, or Anerkennung, and this is a really kind of interesting and important piece of Hegel. So, when people talk about Hegel, they tend to talk about the dialectic and this sort of the unity of opposites, and this idea of inherent contradictions. But the other part of Hegel, another kind of key piece is this idea of recognition. And it's particularly something that was taken up by the French Hegelians, particularly a guy named Kojève, who really, if you want to understand most modern French philosophy, he's the kind of secret underwriter of a lot of it. So he was a huge influence on, Kojève was an influence on Sartre, on Lacan, Derrida, Foucault, Merleau-Ponty. And yet, if you took like a French philosophy course, he would not be discussed. He was a white Russian.
Yeah.
He fled, he was part of an aristocratic Russian family, that fled during the revolution.
How are you
So
spelling that name? I'm going to have to look this up.
it's Kojeve. I think originally his name was like Koženikov
Okay, and he
but
francicized it. Yeah.
Yeah, and he really had a book called, based on his lectures, called An Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, which really centered on recognition and the master-slave dialectic, which is part of Hegel's way of trying to explain the struggle for recognition. So briefly, the master-slave dialectic is this kind of proto-historical moment, where you have these two people who are start off equal, and they're this kind of fight for status, and one eventually wins and enslaves the other one. So in this fight for recognition, he can't, if he kills the other one, that's no good, because you can't get any recognition from a dead person. So
yeah.
So the victor enslaves the other one, but then so you have a master and servant, or master and slave. But the trouble is that the master finds that the recognition that this person gets from the slave isn't of value to them anymore, because they're this lower status person. And then the slave, by being forced to do work, actually gets their own different kind of recognition, and in working with nature and being able to transform nature, Hegel says, and Kojève, that this person recognizes that they're free. And so also in Hegel, this is very difficult to understand, frankly, part of Hegel, but this idea of recognition is also tied to freedom for Hegel. So free will or freedom is almost like a kind of socially constructed thing, like, people are free because they are around other people who see them as free. And so this also helps you to, explains Sartre, like when Sartre talks about the gaze, Sartre says, this other person looks at me and I become an object to this other person. And in so doing, Sartre says, like, I lose my freedom. And it's like, well, why do you lose your freedom? It traces back to this idea from Hegel. Anyway, this really kind of, to my mind, this idea of recognition is a kind of a metaphor, but it has this huge amount of explaining power for education and for life. It's this battle for recognition, and why do we want recognition from people that we see as above us, or higher than us, and why do we not care about recognition from people we see as below us? It explains why, like my son is 12 and he's got a bunch of WhatsApp groups that he's on with his friends, and all they do is roast each other. He was part of he's in a rugby club where very nice London experience where like each of the Six Nations is represented in the rugby club. So all the different kids were rooting for different countries.
Yeah.
And my son showed me his WhatsApp chat, and it was just a string of bubbles saying, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. And the kids are just like, it sort of worries me a bit. Maybe I need to pull them off of it.
You're sure that you're not, this isn't the breeding ground for toxic masculinity here.
Yeah. But it's also, what would Hegel say? This is the battle for recognition, where they're in this double bind because they want to destroy each other, but then they need each other.
To come back to the way that you described the master-slave thing in Hegel, on the face of it, it sounds a little bit like the plot summary of A Star is Born, except at the end where the slave or the person who's kind of on the way down recognizes that they're free.
Yeah.
I don't quite get that bit. Now, how do we relate that to modern education and training? Perhaps
I think that the freedom is that they get to experience their agency like through the work. The work recognizes them. How does this come into education? I think that self-determination theory is the kind of the main thing that, when people talk about motivation in learning, and so it's autonomy. People talk about autonomy, relatedness, and mastery.
Yeah, this is ringing a bell from an earlier episode of Great Minds on Learning. I'll have to go back as fast to.
But in a way, like they all kind of, in a way, maybe I've just been Hegelianized, but like what I see in all of those is a kind of recognition, that like they're getting recognition from the work, from like this experience of mastery, of getting better at something, and then they're experiencing that recognition interpersonally, where people are seeing them differently when they can talk about something fluently, they can see you doing something better, and in a way, autonomy as well is itself a kind of type of recognition that would be very resonant, for Hegelians, again, because of this tie of freedom and recognition, and also, it's I guess, tied to love, or again, to go back to the Symposium in Plato, that Kojève would say that desire is always desire for the other's desire. So, what we want is, we want our partner, or, whoever, not just as an object, but as a subject. We want them to want us. It's a desire for mutuality.
Yeah, this is reminding me of René Girard, who says that what we desire is what somebody else desires, that other people mediate our desire. They give us, because a human being is a desiring creature that doesn't know what to desire, basically. So we get everything from kind of advertising, from Twitter. That's where we get all our desires from. And it's always a triangle. Desire is always a triangular relationship, he says. It just reminded me of that. We need to move on now to, thanks for all the stuff about the Germans. That's really interesting, because there's a side of Hegel you brought up there, which I don't think we covered very much in Great Minds on Learning, and a bit on Hegel. We talked about other stuff with him, and it's really good to have that put in. And talking of Great Minds on Learning, bringing it back to me, I'm going to give you a sneak preview of what Donald and I are going to be covering the upcoming season now. We're just get your comment on this. I think we're starting with leadership, which will be Burns, Drucker, Kellerman, Pfeffer. Might be someone talking about motivation in there. Then we do the invention of writing. So we'll be going back to this thing about kind of Homer and earlier to the invention of writing in the various places where it emerged in Sumeria and China, wherever, and what that did for learning. We'll be doing psychoanalysts. So that's coming up to really the 20th century, including Freud, of course, and Klein, Erikson, Rogers. And then we'll be doing continental theorists, Heidegger, Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida, Foucault. So it's interesting how this conversation has touched a lot of those bases. And we'll have a Q&A session for one of those. So overall, how does that sound? What hopes and fears would you have for how we might treat those topics?
Well, leadership, I can't wait to hear. I mean, we all know Donald Clark's take on leadership, and I'm sure that'll be fun to hear that. Just a random kind of point about Drucker. He wrote a fantastic autobiography. Whatever you think about Drucker, I mean, and I think he's very clever, but his autobiography is describing his life in Vienna at the time. Really remarkable. And he has actually nice segue into psychoanalysis, because he had a really interesting take on Freud, because he grew up with him. He grew up in Vienna at the time that
right.
Freud was emerging. And he has his kind of sets his business management mindset to Freud. So that's all I'll say about that. But knowing Donald, he probably knows about it already. About psychoanalysis, I know, again, I don't think Donald Clark is in any way a fan, but
not at all, no.
But I guess I just I am, and I don't know, it's a bit like whatever. I'm not a car person, but I think that old Volvos are beautiful, but it doesn't mean, it doesn't mean that I want to buy one. I don't want to drive one, but I still think that they're super cool. You can admire things and not agree with them or buy into them. I would have liked to see some discussion of Lacan. I'm a big Lacan fan, but that would probably be too much.
Not sure he talks that much about learning, does he?
Well, he does in a way. He he has a concept of university discourse, and I would hope he'd talk about transference. Transference is a really important idea. Also, the subject's supposed to know, and also actually this is part of transference, but what Lacan calls the imaginary versus what he calls the symbolic or real. And it's very tied to his critique of American psychoanalysis. This is Lacan, where he saw in American psychoanalysis, there was a move where, Freud famously would sit on the couch and not look at the subject. He just listened to them. And so the locus of psychoanalysis, as it were, was the words, was the speech. And American psychoanalysis turned that around, and it became an American style, me, looking at you, and became very relational. All of a sudden it became about, role modeling and this kind of trying to leverage transference and countertransference. Whereas Lacan was saying that, the real psychoanalysis is about words, and it's about language, and he was using the kind of the French structural linguistics at the time to try to unpack that. in a way, I think that there is a certain resonance for what we do in learning, where there is this kind of that struggle again that we're talking about in the symposium, of that there are relationships, but there's always something that is decoupled from the relationship, and that where truth and knowledge can be set free and have its own life. I think that sounds really probably recherche and abstract, but I just wanted to share that.
No, that's very interesting, and it's
you're
related to
being
podcasting as well. Of course, podcasting being a medium of the
yeah,
voice and
yeah,
web.
absolutely, yeah, and Donald has talked about some of the research around the superior, in some cases, superior effects of audio only. And some of this comes down to the face, which is an incredibly French and psychoanalytic motif, and that like, and it's also why some simulated learning can work better, is that we're not spending this time looking at each other's faces, looking for something that isn't there, and that's a completely Lacanian kind of, again, theme. About continental philosophy, yeah, I guess I'm super excited. I mean, Heidegger, whatever you think, Heidegger was an awful person. And I think history is discovering that it's like, we thought he was bad. Turns out he was worse. He was a complete dickhead. Like, sorry, I can't think of a better word. He was awful. Like, slept with like loads and loads of students. Was a Nazi, as we all know, but was also just a bully, was just a pretty nasty character. But I think many people that I respect would argue that he was one of the most important minds of the 20th century. And as Graham Harman puts it, his ideas can't be unseen. Once you kind of are aware of them,
comes back to that thing of, you can learn good things from bad people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Thanks for those reflections, and they will guide us as we put that next season together, I'm sure. So lastly, we've been talking largely about figures from history, some of them from more recent than others. Who among the living do you follow at the moment and look up to and look out for? I'm really interested in this one, because you've kind of covered such a wide, so many bases, such a wide spectrum of people in the discussion so far you've brought up. But who's around at the moment that you?
Well, there's two people that are recently passed that I want to mention, that I've always been a great admirer of, and they'll actually relate to a lot of what you're going to be talking about in your next episodes. And so the first is Friedrich Kittler, who is a German theorist, taught actually at the University of Berlin, I think. When he was alive, died maybe 5 years ago. He was a kind of a post-structural media theorist who wrote, to my mind, beautiful books about the history of technology. And the second is Bruno Latour, who died, I think, just 2 years ago now. And I was a latecomer to Bruno Latour. I don't know why. It's like a great regret in my life that I didn't read him sooner. But he's delightful. He's an incredibly brilliant and subtle and encyclopedic theorist and anthropologist, and he's fun and he's funny, and he's completely maverick, in his approach. He called himself the only French pragmatist, and so it's not your typical French theory. Bruno Latour, he's bringing in a lot of cool other stuff, like Whitehead, for example, and William James. And I think that if you want to understand technology, I think Bruno Latour, from a conceptual philosophical standpoint, he's one of the places to start. The last person, someone who is actually alive, Graham Harman, is an absolutely brilliant shining star of contemporary philosophy.
Graham Harman. Yeah.
Graham Harman, yeah, he's clear. He's a kind of a Latourian. He wrote his PhD on Heidegger and did a lot of work around Heidegger's philosophy of technology, but has kind of expanded out since. And he's just incredible. He's a very humble guy. He's a very clear writer. And yeah, you should have me on, John, and we'll do a philosophy of technology thing. Or I don't know, maybe not. I shouldn't say that on a podcast. That's like
Yeah. You're welcome. No, it'd be great to have you back. I've really enjoyed this.
I hope so. I feel like maybe after
Yeah.
this will be the last time you'll invite me on, because
I'm
I
sure
didn't think I was going to
last time.
talk this much, but it's what I always
Well, you know, it's longer than than what we normally do. Listening to Lex Friedman's podcast has kind of reset my my kind of scale in terms of what a long podcast is. I just listened to a 4-hour podcast you did on Gaza, but so we've just done a kind of mere hour and a half, I think, so which I think is great, and we may edit it down a bit, we may not. I just thought it was really interesting. Thanks a lot for doing it today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, John.
Look forward to the next time.
Yeah, but yeah, last time, I have to say, last time I did it, I loved the podcast, but I also loved our chat afterwards. And we talked about John le Carré and Hemingway and Hemingway versus Fitzgerald. And
yeah, Hemingway, that old Hemingway versus Fitzgerald.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah. That's about my level, so
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to our sponsors.
The Learning Hack is among the top 5% most listened to podcasts globally, according to Listen Notes, we found out. But it depends for its existence solely on sponsorship and your Patreon contributions. If you want us to continue holding these excellent conversations about learning, it's you who said they're excellent, not us. Let's have a chat about your company sponsoring. Or sign up to patreon.com/learninghack, and for a piddlingly small amount of money, get transcripts, text summaries, and early access. Keep us alive. Until next time.
Stay classy, learning people.
Now I finally get it.